I liked the father and son best.
Hi, I'm Helen Evelev from Philadelphia, and we would have about, say 2 buses from Philadelphia for the Vietnam War, opposing the Vietnam War, and then from each university, and there are quite a few in Philadelphia, would have a bus at least. And so I think Philadelphia.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you while you're talking, Lynn, but yeah, it would just take too long if everybody does those recollections now, but put them in the chat by all means, and then we're going to call on people after this presenters go. So welcome, I'm Cole Harrison, Executive Director, Mass Peace Action. There is me. So the film we are discussing tonight takes us back to the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement in 1969, when 2 anti-war protests, the Moratorium and the Mobilization, changed the plans of the Nixon administration and made it politically impossible for Nixon to escalate the war by increasing attacks on North Vietnam. The Moratorium and the MOB came just a month apart from each other, but had somewhat different political framings. We'll start by giving each speaker 10 minutes to talk about the film, their reaction to the story it tells, and their takeaways for anti-war organizing today. Tonight's conversation is being live streamed on Mass Peace Action's YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter channels, and we will send you an email tomorrow with that link in case you want to share the conversation with others or view it again yourself. So with that, let's get started. Our first speaker is Robert Levering. He is the executive producer of The Movement and the Madman, and he was also on the staff of the Mobilization in 1969. Robert.
Thank you, Cole, and really glad to be here this evening. The film that I presume most of you did see the other night started 54 years ago, I guess, when it happened. And I think unlike some films, I mean, this is, this was really a film largely done by people who were involved, directly involved, both as the film team and of course, virtually all of the interviews were people who were there. My own particular role is I was someone who was involved in I worked with AFSC, a Quaker Action Group, and various other anti-war groups. But at for the big national mobilizations, I usually worked with the big mobilization committees in Chicago and New York, and then Philadelphia and Washington, especially Washington. Anyway, the film itself really came out of another film that I worked on called The Boys Who Said No, which was a film about the draft resistance movement. And I see that one of the other people who was involved in that film, Steve Ladd, there were 5 of us. He's here. I mean, he's online, and we there were a group of a half dozen of us who were also draft resistors, that we gave advice and counsel to the executive producer, Christopher Jones, and the director, Judith Ehrlich. And while we were doing that film, I was really, it really was something that I felt very strongly, was that there really hadn't been any films about the overall mainstream anti-war movement. That there'd been films about, I mean, we were doing the one about the draft resistance movement. There's a really great film about the Vietnam vets called Sir, No Sir. And there've been quite a few about the Chicago police riots. And then The Weather Underground has gotten altogether too many films, in my opinion. But at any rate, the result of that, just from our side, in terms of the movement side, is that we really haven't done much to tell our own story. that in fact, what is the story that's told in general? The story that's told is pretty much something that I think most people have a very caricatured and distorted view about what the anti-war movement was about, because the sources of it have been Hollywood, who likes to distort, they like to make things very dramatic and exciting. So it's more exciting to show violence of one form or another, or to try to make it all look like pot smoking hippies. And those of us that were involved in it know that that's very, very far from the truth. So anyway, that was sort of the impetus of it, is to try to create a film that was really about the broad anti-war movement. So Steve Ladd and I decided we would try to find a director who could do this, and it actually took us more than a year to find the right director, which we are very, very happy that we found Steve Talbot, because he's terrific. And then he'd worked a lot with the editor that we had, Stephanie Matura. But now, how do you do a story about the anti-war movement? A movement that went on for more than a decade, had many facets and so on. You have to, when you think about a movie, you have to do something that's, if not, unless you have, the kind of bucks that Ken Burns have, you really have to do something in an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours max. And so the story really that I thought was probably the most doable one, and probably the most interesting, was one that I'd heard from Dan Ellsberg a number of times, talking about how in 1969, the demonstrations actually averted nuclear war. Now, I didn't, as much as I love Dan Ellsberg, I didn't think that was sufficient, basis to do the film. So did a lot of research about it. And lo and behold, there's a lot of formally classified documents that have come out that really show that, the essence of that. So Steve Talbot, who's who's essentially a video journalist and had been for decades, and I had been a business journalist in my life after the movement, we decided to approach it journalistically. And journalistically, what you do is you try to talk to everybody, or talk to as many people as relevant to the story that you're trying to tell. So we just went around and, we found on the movement side, we knew that we'd be able to find people that would be willing to talk. And Sam Brown was, of course, one of the first people we wanted to get hold of. And the other people that are still living that were the other three organizers of the moratorium, David Hawk and David Mixner. And then we, for the two of the major organizers of the moratorium, Cora Weiss and Dick Fernandez, we knew they would be good people to talk with. And so we found them, and then we found other people that were involved. I see that Mary Posner and David Hartso, who are in the film, are actually online with us now. And the two of them were two of the people that also we talked to. But probably the best thing that we, in terms of telling the story, is that we did find three people who worked for Nixon and Kissinger, who were actually on Kissinger's staff. And so we were able to get to them. And of course, a lot of people think that, well, how did you do that? How did you get hold of it? Well, we just found them. The hardest part was finding them, but they were very happy to talk with us. And as you could tell in the film, they were quite open about what happened. And I think even the most surprising thing was that Stephen Bull, who was actually Nixon's personal aide, and let's say he had a different point of view from a lot of other people in the film. But anyway, he was quite willing to talk. So we had all of that. Now, I'll just say one more thing and let others speak, but I'll just say one thing that a lot of people have asked is, how come you don't show any of the people as they are today? who are in the film. And the reason is COVID. We did 6 interviews starting in November of 19. And then in, I think it was in February of 20, we interviewed Dan Ellsberg. And then we were, you know, what do you do then? You know, we had another couple dozen people we wanted to talk to. And we had to either sort of wait until the pandemic was over, which would mean we'd be starting the rest of the interviews about now, or you have to figure out some other methodology. So actually what we decided to do was audio only. And what we wound up doing was, in many cases, we would send a tape recorder to people's houses, nice, safe environment. Or in some cases, they were willing to go to local radio stations and we'd conduct the interviews over the phone, but then it would be recorded well. So anyway, that was just one little tidbit that I thought some people might be interested in. Anyway, that's probably enough from me. Did Cole, do you want Sam to talk next, or?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Let's turn it over to Sam. And it's very appropriate, sadly so, that we're dealing with Dan Ellsberg's framing of the whole situation in what he says is the last 6 months of his life. But we are all in his debt, and it's interesting to think that this film is also. Sam, take it away. Sam is one of the key organizers of the Vietnam Moratorium. You saw him in the film, you heard him. One of the most significant anti-war rallies of the generation in October 1969. Sam Brown. Oh, you got to unmute. Oh, I see. I haven't given you permission. Ha, ha, ha. Okay.
You're muted, Sam. Sam,
All
you're
right.
muted.
I have hereby given you permission. Hope it works. No? Not yet. All right. Let's try it another way. Okay, try it now.
Okay. Hi,
Sorry about that.
that's quite all right. I have to start out simply by saying how much I love the film you made, Robert. I just thought you guys did a fabulous job. I was glad you didn't show a bunch of us in our late 70s and early 80s. I thought it was just right to have just the voices of older people, but with the video of people where they were then. So for whatever reason, I think it actually improved the film not to have a bunch of old geezers talking about what we used to be, but instead having the visual of what it actually was at the time. I do have a small side note on a couple of the people that you got to participate. Dan Ellsberg has written about it, but during the moratorium, we were always concerned that if we said something which was demonstrably wrong, that we would then be, then the administration would come back and say, well, they're just wrong, they're factually wrong. You need so we needed somebody to talk to. And Peter Edelman, who had been on Bobby Kennedy's staff, and Adam Walensky, who's strangely, never mind. But Adam and Peter said, we know a guy. His name is Dan Ellsberg, and you can talk to him. So during the moratorium, I would make phone calls, or he would call me in very obscure places. And I'd say, look, if we say this, are we going to be in trouble? Is that a mistake, or is that right? So he could confirm what we were talking about, which was quite wonderful. The other note, well, anyway, so that little moment in time, the moratorium really grew out of, in some way, important ways, out of Mass PAX. So I want to say a little shout out, because as it said in the movie, it really grew out of discussions in Massachusetts that were started at Mass PAX that led to the idea of the moratorium. And the notion, as you know from the movie and from the time, was really that what we wanted to do was to make something that it was easy, an easy on-ramp for people who had not been active. You don't have to have been an activist. You don't have to get on a bus. You don't have to go anyplace. You can go with your friends. You can do something local. You can make a difference where you are. And the result of that was that lots of people, I don't know, Robert, you said in the movie, I think 2 or 3 million was the estimate, participated in various places around the country. Some in very big demonstrations, like in Boston and San Francisco and Washington, but some in small towns all over the country. And I think that that may have been the most important contribution we could make, was to broaden the base and reduce the notion that it's just a bunch of dope smoking crazies out in the street who were waving Viet Cong flags and chasing all over the countryside. That in fact, lots of just reasonable people like you knew every day who had never said anything about it were also against the war. And that made it accessible for people in politics to begin to become more accustomed and more comfortable affiliating themselves or identifying themselves as anti-war people. So I think that was probably the principal contribution that the moratorium made, was that idea, and then implemented to be able to do that. I have to say, when we went to Washington in June and held a press conference, a fairly presumptuous notion, the 4 of us held the press conference and said, we're going to stop the war, and we're going to stop it starting on October 15th, and then we're going to escalate on November 15th. And, you know, we had 2 rooms on Vermont Avenue and 4 people and a telephone and no money. And over the period of the next 4 or 5 months, we were able to build from that. Somebody I heard earlier saying something about, oh, that was another sort of small anecdote I was going to tell. Those, the poster you saw that said "Fathers and Sons Together Against the War," it was a New York Times ad. There was another one that said "Push button to end war," and it had just like a standard old doorbell button, and then it said, "That's what we're going to do on October 15th. Is we're going to do that." Those guys were the same guys, David Ryder and Lynn Surowitz, who were the Volkswagen ad people at BBD&O. No, that's, yeah, Doyle Dane Bernbach. At Doyle Dane Bernbach, and they were against the war. And they basically gave us how much talent in dollars, I can't tell you, but the result of it was each of those ads, as in the old days, we were paying, I think, $25,000 for a page in the New York Times, and we were commonly getting $100,000 in donations from that ad, from people mailing in small checks, thousands and thousands of people sending us small checks from those ads, which was pretty cool. That they volunteered and we were able to pull together the money to put them in, and then it turned out to be just like a bonanza, which was the reason why Bill Ayers thought he could extort us, was because we had raised a lot of money, and he was the Willie Sutton of the weathermen. He knew where the money was, and so it was us that he came to try to get money to say, we'll behave ourselves on October 15th if you just give us 25 grand or whatever. I can't remember. I think it was $25,000. Which we did not do. But that was really because of those ads that David Ryder and Lynn Surowitz did for us for free. Anyway, that's enough of me sort of adding color to what was, I have one more thing, one more note, which was Anthony Lake was in the movie last night, and then in the White House, and later to be Clinton's national security policy director. And he left the administration. He went to Georgetown or someplace, and he called me like 6 months or a year later, and he said, "Would you write a chapter about the anti-war movement? You know, a book he was writing on Vietnam. Would you write a chapter about Vietnam, about the anti-war movement?" And I did, and I sent it to him, and he sent it back to me with a note saying, you're totally, I wrote a fairly negative assessment saying the war goes on, Nixon's still in office, it's all terrible, we didn't have any impact, nothing changed, blah, blah, blah. And he sent me back a note saying, you have to rewrite this because you're completely wrong and I can't tell you why. And now we know why he thought I was so desperately wrong, was because he knew that it had actually changed the White House, which of course, none of us knew for many years later. So anyway, there you go.
Okay, thank you, Sam. And so next up is Paul Shannon. Paul he joined the movement in 1971, he tells us, and then he jumped in with both feet. He has taught the history of the Vietnam War dozens of times, and he currently chairs the Raytheon Antiwar Campaign, and he is on MAPA's board of directors. Paul.
Thanks, Cole. Well, the first thing I want to say is in watching that film the other night, it was just so moving to see the dedication and the hopefulness of these young people. I was not a part of it. I was off somewhere in the hills of Western Massachusetts, didn't even know what was going on. And finally caught up with what was happening. And I just feel so grateful to Sam and Robert and all those people we saw in all those offices, drinking all the coffee and eating all the hamburgers and all that, to see that operation and the scope of it, and to see that pulled together from a shoestring budget is just, it's just incredibly moving. So I think for those of us who came much later than you all did, I obviously want to express our gratitude for this key moment in the history of the movement and in the history of the Vietnam War. I was just thought I might offer some quick points and focus on just one of them in the short time that I think help put the whole thing in context. The first thing is that in '68, of course, Lyndon Johnson announced in March that he was not going to run for the presidency again. And he talked about a limited bombing halt. At that point, I think most of the country and most of the anti-war movement, you two can correct me, felt that this war was going to end. And time went on. Of course, Nixon made sure that Johnson couldn't help Humphrey by getting the negotiations started in Paris. People, I think, are pretty much aware now of Nixon's act of complete the work of a traitor, really undermining Johnson's attempt to get negotiations started. That's all well documented now. It's a major crime in the United States, but of course, when Republican presidents do these things, nothing happens to them. But that 1969 actually began the worst part of the war. Far from the war ending, in 1969, in fact, the war in Vietnam was just beginning. And far more Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians would be killed between 69 and 75 than had been killed between 1956 and 1968, including the Tet Offensive. During those years, incredible events happened that I don't think anybody has the full knowledge of. One way to look at what was going on is to look at some of the Nixon tapes in the White House that indicated the frustration that was going on there with their inability to defeat the Vietnamese and their frustration with the anti-war movement. I'll just mention Kissinger in late 1970 after the invasion of Cambodia, which brought a whole new country into the war with devastating results. Nixon is raging at Kissinger in the White House out of frustration. Quote, "I want them to hit everything. I want them to use the big planes, the small planes, everything they can that will help out here. And let's start giving them a little shock." There must be something we can do. Late 1970, Nixon's aide Eagle Crow said to the aide of Elliot Richardson, I think Richardson at the time was Secretary of Defense, "My God, don't you people understand? The man is going to blow them off the face of the earth unless they cave in." This is 1970. This is a year after these huge demonstrations for the moratorium. Another White House aide says to Eagle Crow, top White House official, quote, "He told me of the time he was on the phone listening." This is a guy named Young listening in on Nixon and Kissinger's discussion. He was on the phone listening in when Nixon and Kissinger were talking. Nixon was drunk, and he said, "Henry, we've got to nuke them." After the Ellsberg release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, Nixon was totally freaked out that other places had other secret documents, and he wanted to organize the plumbers to go in and get those documents. So in 1971, he's talking to Haldeman about the need to break into the Brookings Institute. God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get them. You ought to break into the place, rifle the files, and bring them out. In 1971, of course, there were the huge rallies sparked by the Vietnam Veterans Against the War in their organizing. There was 250,000 people in Washington, but then at the beginning of the May of that year, there were the Days of Rage in Washington, when 30 to 40,000 protesters went down to do civil disobedience. 7,000 were detained in a football field. 500 workers gathered across from the White House to protest the war. These were federal workers. On April 27th, Nixon and his cabinet were in the White House talking with each other about what to do in preparation for the upcoming militant actions, which would take over Washington, D.C. and shut down the Capitol. Nixon says, if on the other hand, they come in and start breaking up the mimeograph machines, then that's a problem. Then they should be arrested. No ifs, ands, or buts, or maybes. Just look at the level of conversation. This is going on in the White House with his cabinet. John Ehrlichman says, wait a minute, let's be a little bit calm about this. John Mitchell, the Attorney General, breaks in. We're going to destroy these cadres. Nixon continued, you're dealing here with tough, hardcore radicals. They not only want confrontation, but they want to raise hell if they can get away with it. Mitchell joins in. If they can find any way to tear up this place, they're going to do it. And finally, in May 1971, just as those huge civil disobedience actions in Washington were about to take place, Nixon talks to Haldeman about hiring the Teamsters to knock heads. He says, quote, they've got the guys who go in and knock their heads off. Haldeman agreed, saying, and I think they can get away with doing this. You do it with the Teamsters. It's the regular strike busters types and all that. And they're going to beat the shit out of some of these people. And I hope they really hurt them. You know, I mean, smash some noses and stuff. So these are just reflections from the Nixon tapes and from interviews with Nixon's top aides at the time. A lot of this stuff came out, of course, in the Watergate trials, just to show the level of investment that the White House had in everything that was going on in Vietnam, and especially everything that was going on in this country. This affected them tremendously, and their frustration that they, no matter what they did, that they could not beat the Vietnamese just was palpable in their discussions. And even though the moratorium held off this huge escalation in 1969, Nixon was determined all the way through, I will argue, right through 1974 when he left office, to actually win that war and come up with a strategy to do it. And it's an incredible period of time. So many things happened. Invasion of Cambodia, the Pentagon Papers, the takeover of Washington, D.C. Here in Boston, we had 3,000 to 5,000 people in 1971 doing civil disobedience, surrounding the JFK building, the federal building, and shutting it down. 3,000 to 5,000 people risking arrest. 115 of them, including Howard Zinn, Michael Ansara, and some of our other leaders were among those arrested. It was an amazing day that many people don't even know occurred. But these were the types of things going on during this period of time, just amazing stories. And I'm just very, very grateful to Robert and Sam for focusing in on this particular period of time in the war, which was so critical.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I'm going to ask a question to the panel but before I do, let me just urge everyone to get your questions ready. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, go down to the bottom of your Zoom window where it says reactions and use the raise hand icon to raise your hand. And that way we'll know that you've got a question. Sharon has already raised her hand. So be like Sharon and raise your hand. And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask the panel to connect the message that the film tells us of 1969 with the message that Paul tells us of 1969 to 74, in which Nixon continued to try to win the war. So given that he did give up his plans of escalation, he gave up his plans to directly attack North Vietnam with troops, he gave up his idea of using nuclear weapons on North Vietnam and so on. But according to Paul, he still tried to continue to win the war for 4 more years. So how does this all fit together? I just like everyone's take on that. And how did the movement, respond to that, or understand that, or respond to that?
Well, I could start. One thing to sort of, if you step back far enough, there are almost no examples of a movement against a war during the time of war within that country that's at war. I don't know whether I'm saying it very clearly, but
yeah,
every war before in US history has been squashed by the government. And if you have any question about that, you should read Adam Hochschild's latest book, which name I can't remember right this second, but what happened in World War I, where there was a very vibrant socialist movement, and the government, among other things, the most obvious one is about Eugene Debs being put in prison. During the war for speaking out against the war, not for doing anything else, just speaking out against the war. And there were over 1,000 people that were thrown in jail for prison sentences of at least a year during that time. Now, looking at overall America, I mean, even in, we can see the kind of, war fever that we just see sort of come over the country with regard to Ukraine, even though we're not the country at war. I mean, whatever you think about what's going on in Ukraine, you just can't deny the fact that there's a kind of war fever, that to speak out against that war is very, very difficult at this point. But anyway, that's just one point I'd like to make, is that it's really incredible what we were able to mobilize. And I think Dan Ellsberg, what he always says is that the movement did not stop the war, but it put a ceiling on how far it could go, and that saved lives, and that's crucial. And that's certainly what the message in our film is about.
For sure, yeah. Sam, Paul, you want a piece of that?
Yeah, what Paul said is the reason why I wrote such a discouraging chapter for Tony Lake, was because I was discouraged about it. That it just kept going on. And so when he said I had to rewrite it, but he couldn't tell me why, really. I did. And what I focused on were the positive things that had happened: the expansion of the effort, the increasing congressional oversight, congressional concern, the fact that people were prepared to vote for anti-war candidates, which they hadn't been before. So you could find positive things to say, even though in a broad sense, I generally was pretty despondent about the continuation of the war, because it more people died you said after 68, Paul. I think maybe even more died after 69 than had died before 69. There was maybe 30,000 had died up to then, and about 55 altogether. So maybe it was half and half. But in any case, I felt all of that discouragement and depression and sense of loss and frustration. So for me, it wasn't for 15 years or so that I really understood what had happened. I mean, it was when we could begin to talk, when we began to know from Dan originally, and then from declassified papers later, and then from others, that it had made a difference in terms of lives saved. And maybe for the first time, maybe it's not clear whether Nixon really was, not clear to me whether Nixon really was prepared to use nuclear weapons, or whether that was just a negotiating tactic that he was using. But if he was, then we stopped the first nuclear war, the first use of nuclear weapons since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's not nothing. You can pretty much be proud that we were all part of that and participated in it. So, yeah, it went on, but take credit
Yeah,
for
I mean,
what
I think you
happened.
can argue pretty clearly, actually, that those demonstrations saved tremendous numbers of American lives. It was mainly the increase in deaths after 69 were mostly Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians, with the massive bombing campaigns and Operation Linebacker and the mining of the harbors in 72 and all that. But I think all these, the high point may have been of the rallies may have been 69, but these other events, these other organizing events carried out by different parts of the anti-war movement were really just quite an amazing accomplishment. When you think of the things that people that had been, before the war started, totally apolitical, the things that they were capable of, I think that's what's inspiring. And I think the war did go on, huge casualties. I personally believe if we had invaded North Vietnam, which Nixon was considering in 69, since he still had 510,000 American ground troops there, that's why he wanted to use them while he had them there. I think we'd still be looking for those troops in North Vietnam. They would have been chewed up, because if you think it was tough fighting the Viet Cong, if they would have fought the regular Viet Minh army in North Vietnam, that would have been just a slaughter on all sides. The deaths would have been just immense. And so I think the fact that the American troops could not be used anymore as time went on was a huge thing, and it allowed the Vietnamese to regroup and wait until U.S. troop levels got low enough in 72 to be able to bring their entire army to fight the American war machine, and that really turned the tide quite a bit. So there are so many interesting periods of this. Just the 1973 to 75 period, when Nixon signs a peace agreement, which is actually the other side's peace agreement, and then he says, we won the war because we accomplished everything we wanted to accomplish. And he had this big event with all the POWs coming home in all their big uniforms, and they're thanking him for winning the war and bringing them home and all this type of stuff. And so that by 2 years later, in 1975, when the helicopters are taking the remaining Americans out of Saigon, as well as hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, people say, wait a minute. And those events of why the war ended the way it did is simply not understood whatsoever among the American public. And so there's a lot of education to do there. But each of these phases, there were people in each of these phases doing amazing things. And that must not be forgotten. And again, for me, watching the film and just seeing people in those offices doing this work day in and day out, doing an impossible task because they just thought maybe we can do it, is just quite an accomplishment.
Thanks. Okay, let's go to Sharon Rose. I'm going to put you on. How do I do this?
Thank you so much. I want to congratulate you for the film, all of you. I have to say, though, that I think your film, together with The Boys Who Said No, makes both of those better. To watch them together makes both of them better in terms of understanding the context and the history. I remember that I was helping draft resistors, and they played a major role in sparking the anti-war movement. And also I was working against the draft, and actually I regret that part. I regret that we demanded the end to the draft. I don't think that they ended the draft because of us. There's plenty of evidence that they wanted all along, they wanted to have this so-called volunteer armed force. And I think that, and I'm wondering what you think about this, I think that what we need now is a movement against the economic draft, because clearly that's what we have. People who have less opportunities in life are more attracted to joining the military, and it shows up because in the composition of the masses of people in the military and of those who have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, et cetera. And so I think that we need to go into every high school and talk to kids about resisting that economic draft and not working for the war machine.
Yeah, and there's a national network against the militarization of youth that coordinates that kind of work. Yes. Anyone from the panel want to speak to Sharon's point?
Yeah, well, I'll say I don't agree with reintroducing the draft for many reasons, but the main thing to me, I mean, one, the Vietnam War wouldn't have happened the way it did without the draft. It was a draft that enabled Johnson to just put in, turns out to be several million people right into the war. And it just sort of happened really quickly as a result of that. The second point is that the military doesn't need more people than they've already got. And a draft would, so if you think for 1 second that the resistance that was going on in the 60s against the draft, imagine what it would be like now, particularly if they would introduce women into it.
Exactly.
I mean, resistance, I know, but that resistance, well, anyway, but the most important thing is that we should concentrate on where in the devil are all these troops. We have over 800 or 900 bases all over the world. That's what needs to be stopped. We don't need to have a huge military. And, to militarize, to bring back the draft is one more step of militarizing the society, which we don't need. That's
great. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to say, I have mixed feelings about it, but I think I really appreciate the work you did, Sharon, to stop the draft. Because I think with Iraq and Afghanistan, if they had a draft when they were still actually using ground troops to fight these wars, which they don't anymore, really, I think those things could have been even worse than they were. I think a lot of people, if they're drafted, even if they were against the war, would have still gone in and fought. And I don't think we want to create that pool of cannon fodder. So I understand a lot of my friends feel exactly the way you do, that by getting rid of the draft, it made it undermined organizing against the war. That's a good argument. I can't argue against it, but I think on balance, it's best not to let them have access to young people, because young people will, you draft them, even if they disagree, they're going to go because they're not going to go to jail.
But they're drafting people now. They're drafting young Black people and Latino people in disproportionate numbers.
Yeah, and look what happened with the draft. I mean, that was look at Operation 100,000 with with McNamara drafting 100,000 African Americans from the ghetto. That is going to go on anyway. And of course, the soldiers in today's wars are a lot older than the kids that fought in Vietnam. But anyway, I'm not saying the issue is resolved, but it's. I'm just glad that they don't have the draft to draw on. We're trying to stop them from signing kids up in Massachusetts. They want to make it so anyone who gets a driver's license has to sign up for the draft.
Great, thanks. Okay, next up is going to be Paravash Rohani. Paravash.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I would like to pose a question from a viewpoint of an immigrant. Before that, I would like to lay out the background. I am a refugee from Iran, and I have been in my homeland persecuted by the Iranian government, and I should be very angry with the government of Iran, but I'm not, just because we have a lot of admonishment and guidance from the Baha'i writings and Baha'i institutions to be forgiving and to be gentle and nonviolent and so on and so forth. And my question is, in the film, I noticed that masses of participants in protests were very disciplined and they were very nonviolent and kind. And I was wondering, how did you get that sense of discipline to go along so peacefully? And for that matter, how the Vietnamese population are not so angry that they should be. They are not that angry with the situation that went in their land. And we as Baha'is, we have been very peaceful, but how the masses here have adhered to that discipline.
Well, one thing, I'm sure the organizers for the moratorium have their thoughts on it, but one thing is, in the United States in the 1960s, because of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Thomas Merton and all these people just caught on throughout the whole country, with people saying violence and war have to go. Here we have a whole different approach to life itself, not just to war. And that impacted huge numbers of Americans. That coming together with the fact that Americans before the war were, and still were during the war, extremely patriotic. And it was when they saw their country doing things that they thought that they knew were criminal, a country that they had believed in, that they had loved, that they were willing to join the Peace Corps and all these things. When they saw that country committing these incredible crimes, and given the lessons of the Holocaust, how could people have gone along with those things? All of this came together, especially with the belief system of nonviolence. And so Martin Luther King was just an incredible source of power to make those demonstrations nonviolent. I mean, when you see what they were doing to African Americans in the South and the persecution they were undergoing with the cops and the police and everyone else under the sun, and to see their discipline, that transferred, I think. Everybody in the peace movement that I knew read Gandhi.
Sam, Robert, a comment on the nonviolence?
Well, all I was going to say is that I think that what Paul just said is absolutely true, that there was an ethos that drove people in that direction generally. There were people who went the other direction, of course, but the vast bulk of the people were driven by that. But it's also true what Robert said, that there were 4,000 or 5,000 trained monitors to make sure that people trained in nonviolence, but nonetheless trained to keep people within the boundaries and out of the street, and not being difficult with the police. And I mean, there was also a hell of a lot of work that went into that, in addition to the general ethos. There was, I mean, we focused in crazy ways. We thought, you know, if people come there and there's no place to go to the bathroom, they're going to go into the stores and they're going to piss off everybody in the stores when they go in there. So what we had to do was to put out porta potties so that people didn't make everybody else in town angry. But there were only 2 people that we could think of who knew how many porta potties you needed for 500,000 people who were going to be there. And the only people we could think of were the US military, which was not likely to be helpful to us, and the people who had organized Woodstock, who did it badly, but they had learned a lesson from it. So literally, there was conversation with Mike Lang and those people who organized Woodstock. How many toilets do we need? And there was a very smart young woman from Radcliffe, who was in charge of toilets. And she made sure that there were enough toilets for everybody. I mean, so yes, there was an ethos, but there was an ethos reinforced by a lot of hard work to take the rough edges off of it and make it easier for people to not to follow that ethos.
Right.
Well,
Go ahead, Robert.
I just want to echo that it wasn't just that people believed philosophically in nonviolence. You know, the civil rights movement was the discipline and training was very much part of it. And that was one of the things that carried over into the anti-war movement. That's all I have to say.
Great, thank you. Let's call up Stan Becker. Stan.
Thank you. The film demonstrated very well that the reading of the names of those killed was very powerful. Question is, where did this originate? Was it someone in AFSC? And maybe David Hartzog after me knows that. But we did similar thing with the Boots Project AFSC had, and we read names here where the boots were laid out on the campus and read names and rang a gong. And it's a very powerful witness. And that hasn't been mentioned tonight. I think that was very well shown in the film around the country, people doing that. Thank you.
David can answer that. He's next.
All right, I guess we can call up David if you wish. Go ahead, David.
Okay, it was Stuart Meacham who was the head of the peace section of the American Friends Service Committee. It was his brainchild to do the March Against Death, which I think played a very important role in setting the tone for the big actions the next day. I just wanted to congratulate Robert on a really fantastic film, and wanted to thank Sam for your really wonderful organizing of the moratorium. And in terms of lessons learned for today, I'd be especially interested to hear from Sam when we're risking nuclear war. We're getting closer and closer with both Russia and China and North Korea. And also the endless wars. What do you feel are the lessons learned about how we would go about trying to organize a moratorium today. A grassroots movement across the country that would have that same power. And I know it's a long-term job, but how would you start?
Well, it seems to me that the sort of existential issues that we need to deal with are the risk of nuclear war and the risk associated with climate change. And neither of those are easily susceptible to the same sort of organizing, I think, as the war, partly because it's more abstract. It's not intimate like the war was for so many people, partly because it's kind of diffuse. It's hard to figure out. I've actually been involved with Bill McKibben, whom some of you may know, and Heather Booth and a bunch of other people you probably know, in working on climate change stuff and trying to figure out how you get a sort of on-ramp for people to express their concern and outreach about climate change. And I would say we've had sort of mixed success. We had a couple hundred demonstrations last week, actually, on the 23rd, outside banks that are funding fossil fuels. It was great, but it was not the same thing. It didn't reach out in the same way. So I'm not sure I know, because I think if I knew, I'm old enough and have enough economic security and still can find my way around, that I'd be spending a whole lot more of my time trying to do it if I could figure out what it was I was going to do. So I think all ideas welcome, because I sure can't. I mean, we did have this thing, that I mentioned to you called Third Act, which was a bunch of people the age of many of the people on this call who are in our third act. We had a good first act, then we raised our families and kids. Time for a third act. And I think there are a lot of people my age and around my age who would actually love to be involved again if we could figure out the precise mechanism that might make it possible for them to be involved. And like Dan Ellsberg, I've been sort of obsessed about nuclear weapons for the last X years of my life, as much as by these wars of convenience and choice that the United States has waged, that I opposed. But the big threat to all of us really is the nuclear threat and the climate threat, it seems to me. My wife thinks the easiest thing to organize around right now is guns. That you probably, because it impacts so many people and the view of the population is so big, it doesn't pose the same threat as those two big existential issues. But maybe she's right, that if people get active, then they'll find their way to be active in other things. That's certainly what happened with the civil rights movement, which morphed for many people directly into anti-war activity.
Thank you. And they're all related, obviously. All the different problems.
Well, thank you so much. Let's call up Mary Posner now.
One thing I have noticed around the discussion of the Vietnam Moratorium Committee is people act as if it ended in November. And maybe we didn't understand what was going on in Muncie, but we did things in December, January, February, March, and in April, Sam Brown came to Ball State University and spoke. But yet, historically, I never hear anything about the Vietnam Moratorium after the November demonstrations. And I'm just curious why that is. And I just also want to say the film was incredible. And because I had a small part in the film, I've been invited to speak to a lot of media around where I live in Southern Indiana. And a lot of the people who have interviewed me have been young women, and they are hungry for a role model. They are hungry for some inspiration. They are amazingly inspired by what we did. And we have I can just see that we have an opportunity now to use this documentary to wake people up and say there is something you can do. So this movement doesn't end with this film, the impact of it will continue in ripples for a long, long time. And so that has been incredible. But I would like to know why nobody ever talks about the moratorium after November.
Mary, I think, it's the simple reality. After November, it became more isolated local actions. You continued at Ball State, and others around the country in isolated places continued. But there was never that same kind of outpouring. And partly, I suspect some of that, if you were to be cynical about it, had to do with the fact that in December and January, people were going home to their families and then studying for final exams, and they'd been working so hard in the anti-war stuff, they were afraid of flunking out of school if they were students, and people had to get back to whatever life they had that was making it possible for them to be active, that is, whatever economic life they had. So I think the reason the media doesn't cover it so much is just the pure reality that it was a much less visible set of activities around the country until Kent State and the Cambodia demonstrations, or the next time that really people began to see that. But I think that's the reason why you don't hear much about it, is because in most places there wasn't much about it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Let's call now in John McAuliffe. John.
There. All right. I actually want to follow directly on that conversation. I was part of the new MOB, and I remember that we had a somewhat jaundiced view of the moratorium, that it hadn't been radical enough. It hadn't raised the right issues strongly enough. But in retrospect, I think in some ways it may have been a mistake to have gone in November to a mass demonstration, sort of the old style mass demonstration, and wonder if, one of the things that happened was that the moratorium was sort of displaced by the mass turnout event. And so as opposed to its original idea of 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, in some ways I wonder if the discipline of the moratorium, the broadness of participation, staying local and doing more and more around the country what had been done the first time, had that happened in November and December, that might have actually been more powerful than what was a wonderful event in Washington. I don't want to in any way discount the importance of what happened in Washington, but I wonder whether, if we're looking at ourselves the way other people look at their own histories, or about what worked and didn't work, whether that was a mistake. The other thing I wanted to say is that I'm very impressed. There were 115 people or so have been on this. I hope, in a sense, that everybody who's on this takes the film and uses it in their community organization or their religious organization or their school. It's available streaming probably into the indefinite future on Great Experience, on PBS, a shorter time unless you have the passport system. But I think that having this film seen and trying to get people who are doing environmental work and doing gender work and doing the many kinds of things that still preoccupy people would be very important to have happen. The other thing I think is important is local history. What this has done is it's focused on some of the local stuff, particularly what Mary was doing, but it's a national story of local events, but still national. if in every community people make the effort frankly, while we're still alive, to collect documents, to get things into county historical societies and university histories and other places, so that this is not lost. I mean, we're in this funny historical moment now where the Russians are playing the American role in Ukraine, and we're playing the Russian and Chinese role in Ukraine. That is, the Russians are the aggressor and the country that's trying to use its power, military power, directly to control another population, while we are doing what the Russians and Chinese did in Vietnam, which is provide the means for that resistance against the aggressor to happen. And I think that's led to a lot of confusion about what the proper peace movement approach is in this situation. But go back to what I said, is I think that just this film is a treasure, that Steve and Bob and Steve have created something that we need to think about how it can really be utilized all over the country, at all levels and all kinds of contexts, and that it isn't just a great night on PBS and then we go on to the next.
Thanks, John. Reactions from the panel.
Hi, John. The first, I want to go to the very first part of what John said, which was because, as he well knows, and others who were involved at the time, there was also a rather jaundiced view of the MOB from the Moratorium headquarters. We were concerned about a number of things, including we had gotten the UAW to endorse. They were not going to be enthusiastic about the politics of some of the MOB. It was not an easy decision about sort of how to proceed. And I think all of us made mistakes at that time, because in retrospect, the sort of amount of energy that went into organizing in November then just left people kind of spin. It's not as easy to organize a bus to go to Washington and spend a day and come back and as it is to do something in your local community and then think about doing it again the next month. You wouldn't think about going to Washington 2 months in a row. It's just too much. But you would think about doing something at home. So, none of us can go back and redo it. But I think if we had a redo, John, we might be able to have more easily found a common ground that might have projected the same breadth that we had in October on into November and December. Maybe, I don't know. If you have you just have to see what happens. It's what I said to Mary in response to Mary's question. People do things and then they have to return. They got to get their grades in order. They've got to do this, or they've got to take care of their family. They've got to do something else. So for most people, going to Washington is a one-time thing and then sort of one and done. And I think maybe it would have been better if we had focused more locally. But we can't go back and reinvent that. November was terrific. It was a terrific day, as it turned out. In spite of a lot of hesitations that people had about it, it was a great day. And at the time, as you will recall, if either you or I had suggested that we could sit down and have that discussion late in September, it would, I think, not have gone anywhere. It would have been dead on arrival. So, the fact that we can have it now 54 years later or whatever doesn't really change anything, although it's interesting what you said, and I agree with it.
I'll just say on the second point, sorry, let me, on the second point, we do intend to do something with our, in terms of getting the film and resource materials into colleges and high schools. And so that's what we're very much focused on. I put in the chat a couple of times the link to the streaming, and you can stream it now, for free on American Experience's website. But it's going to be on. It's on Prime Video right now. I think you have to pay $5.95, and it's not free, but $5.95. I mean, hey, a cappuccino or whatever. We're not talking about a huge expense, and making it available. Of course, that's what those of us that made the film want. We want it out there as much as possible, and we had a great send off, and certainly a lot more than most filmmakers could ever dream of in terms of numbers of people have watched it already. But we definitely want it to be watched more. And since I have the floor for 1 second, let me just also mention there's a great book that Carolyn Eisenberg, who's in the film, recently published called Fire and Rain, based on her at least a decade's worth of research into what was going on with Nixon and Kissinger. She's gone through oodles and oodles of the tapes, documents that have been declassified and so on, but it really tells the story that's the central part of the film that we told part of. And I'll put that in the chat too.
Yeah, and we had her on just about a month ago talking about her book, and she was kind of expanding the quotes you gave her in the film to the whole period. But yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Oh, can I just ask Robert a question? What was the viewership? How was as I guess they say in the trade, what were the numbers like on Tuesday?
They haven't calculated it completely yet, but it's certainly as many people watched it as came to Washington on November of '69. I mean, we're talking in the hundreds of thousands of people just already for starters. But they anticipate. I mean, their initial guess was that there would be over 100,000 would stream it in the first 2 weeks after the initial showing. So it definitely, and then the way that PBS operates, it'll be on again and again and again.
Well, one other thing to keep in mind in terms of follow-up to the moratorium is that by 1970, U.S. casualties dropped in half. And then again in 71, they dropped in half again. And so as fewer body bags were coming home, the reality is the general public's attitude toward the war would kind of come and go, depending on whether they thought American lives were at stake. They did not like the war, but they certainly did not want to lose. Far more people in 1968 wanted to escalate than wanted to end the war by popular opinion. So we were going up against a very volatile public opinion situation in the country as we went through these different phases in the war. And certainly the troop levels started to drop dramatically, especially after the Cambodia invasion. And all that was having an impact on what we could do.
Well, thanks. I'm just going to call on one more questioner, Louise, and then I'll ask the panelists to make a final comment and we'll wrap. Louise, you're on.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention a current project that Mass Peace Action is helping with. It's Vets for Peace is sponsoring the Golden Rule voyage. It's a nuclear weapons abolition educational effort, and the people in it are mostly Vietnam vets. They're sailing up the East Coast in a little sailboat called the Golden Rule, and they're going to be. It's you can see it on Mass Peace Action's website, or go to Vets for Peace. It's coming up the East Coast. It'll be in Boston in the middle of June. And it'll be stopping also with the other cities on the way up, and doing as much education as possible, going to schools, libraries, putting on all kinds of presentations. So there's one captain, but the crew is anybody who wants to get on and help sail. So it's it'll be really interesting, really educational, and I think also fun. So you can see it on the Mass Peace Action's website, Vets for Peace.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
Well, so let's ask each of our panelists to make a final comment, and then we'll wrap. Robert, you want to go first?
Well, it's been extraordinarily gratifying to see all of you show up to discuss the film. That's a really wonderful, it makes us feel really great to see the support that we've gotten. But I think that what John raised is really the next step. I mean, this is, we're going to glow for a couple of days, if not weeks. But what's really important is for this film, we hope that this film will be something that can be used, and particularly with younger people, because what we've seen is that this really is very inspiring for people who are interested in social change in one form or another. That's the message that we tried to give. And as Cora Weiss says at the end of the film, we didn't give up. Don't give up.
Thank you. Sam?
Well, I want to start as I started before by saying thanks to Steve and Robert and the people who put this film together and got it on, because I think it was a brilliant piece, and I think it will have use. It probably won't be used in the schools in Florida, where, as far as I can tell, nothing will be used shortly in the schools in Florida. But I think that that there is a real opportunity to use the film to help educate people and to move the next step. I just think that for those of us who were active then and are now still upright, that it would be, that figuring out how we can take our experiences and our wisdom, presumed wisdom, and apply it to the problems we face today is a really critical question. I mean, how do we get people together to think together about what we might do about these really overwhelming problems in the society? So I hope this film will help create some discussions about that among a broad group of people, and I'm very grateful that you did it and to have been a small part of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. Paul, your closing thoughts?
Well, I would just say that this thing of Vietnam was a really big deal. It's one of the biggest deals in human history. And I think because of that, our country can't really digest it. And it keeps on rumbling around out there. So I think having this film and showing one particular moment in that war and what people were capable of, I think is really important, because there's just still so many lessons to learn from that war. And one of them being what was accomplished by the moratorium in '69. There are a lot of others on the importance of getting our narrative straight about various conflicts. But I don't think Vietnam, even after all these years, is going to go away. The country knows that something happened there. People don't want to think about it much, but it is not digestible. And so I hope this film will help those who don't want to digest it to understand it better.
Well, thank you to Sam. We do have a program on lessons from Florida. Actually, we're partnering with Historians for Peace and Democracy. I believe it's April 11th, and we have a faculty union activist from Florida who's going to come on and talk about that. So thanks for bringing that up. But I'll just say that we at Mass Peace Action are as upset about the war in Ukraine as some of the speakers here tonight were. Our take is that both sides are to blame. The US and NATO have been provoking Russia and threatening it for years, but that did not justify Russia to invade Ukraine, and Russia has to get out, but the US also should stop fanning the flames, and we all need to negotiate. We are preparing with our Peace in Ukraine Coalition a signature ad. I think Sam mentioned signature ads being used back in 1969, that we are going to try to raise enough money to put an ad in. It hadn't even occurred to us that we could make money by an ad, but we're just trying to get the ad in. But that's a good tip. Thank you. To express to President Putin, President Biden, and President Zelensky that they need to stop the fighting and negotiate. So that's one thing we're going to be working on in the next couple of months. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. We will send a video out to you in the morning so that you can watch this conversation again, and you can also spread it to your friends. We appreciate all the serious interaction from the attendees with their questions and comments in the chat. A lot of robust debate going on in the chat. And thanks so much to Sam, Paul, and Robert for their activism, and above all to Robert and his team for producing an incredible film that we're going to be able to use as an educational resource for years to come. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.